Today is Friday, July 24th, 2020. I'm Todd Moy, and I'm interviewing Ale Checka for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin and for the University of North Texas Oral History Program. Ms. Checka, this interview is going to be placed in both the Nettie Lee Benson archive at UT Austin and in UNT's archives. If there's anything you don't want to talk about that I ask about, just say so. And if there's something that you do want to talk about that I don't ask about, let me know and we'll talk about it. Because we're not conducting this interview in person, I need to record you consenting to place our interview in the archive. So I'm going to ask a series of questions. If you could, please just say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree to each of these. First of all, the Voces Oral History Project wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs or other documentation that you provide at the Benson Library at UT Austin. Voces will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials that you donate to the project. Do you give Voces consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library?
I do, I agree.
Do you grant Voces copyright over the interview and any material that you provide?
I do, I agree.
That, of course, will not prevent you from using the interview however you want to use it. Do you agree to allow Voces to post the interview on the internet where it might be viewed by people around the world?
I do, I agree.
Okay, and of course that should influence what you choose to talk about and the terms you choose to. When I ask you about the Fort Worth Independent School District, for instance, know that this may be viewable in those offices. We have many questions in a pre-interview form that we've already filled out. Voces uses that information to help researchers. The entire form is kept in a secure server. Before they send it to the Benson archive, they will have stripped out any contact information for yourself or family members, so that won't be part of the public file. And your public file will only be accessible at the Benson Library. Do you wish for Voces to share the rest of your interview and your public file available to researchers at the archive?
Like address and phone number and that sort of thing?
Exactly.
Let's not do that.
Let's not do that. Perfect. And the last question, Voces receives requests from time to time from journalists who want to contact interview subjects. They only deal with legitimate news outlets. Do you give consent for Voces to share your phone number or your email with journalists should the need arise?
Sure.
Great, thank you. All right, let's get going. I always like to start these at the beginning. So would you please tell me who you are and where and when you were born?
I'm Ale Checka. I was born in Hackensack, New Jersey in 1978. That is a very little known fact. My parents, my dad was working for a company out of Mexico City that sent him to New York. And I get the impression that I was like not quite planned. So my parents ended up having a kid while they were, while my dad was working in New York City, and then our family moved back to Mexico. Well, back for them and like for the first time for me. And so when I was very, very little, we lived in Cuernavaca, just outside of Mexico City. And then after that, we moved, but emigrated at that point, because when we moved in the US for like where I was born, my parents had no intention of staying there. Mm-hmm. That was just like the assignment. And then the peso devaluated in the 80s. And my parents were like, we can't deal with this government. So we moved to the US, and my dad had gone, my dad had done business school at UTA. So that's how we ended up in Arlington, Texas, right before I started kindergarten. So I did K through 12 in kindergarten. So that was probably more than you were asking.
Well, no, and the devaluation of the peso, was their major reason for immigrating as far as you know, or were there other reasons?
No, that was it. They had their savings in dollars, and the government just passed a law saying that the bank could give it back in whatever currency they wanted. So my parents lost all of their savings. And like, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But Mexico's a very difficult place to live. You know, it's a difficult place to live. And I think my parents and I have a similar dynamic to a lot of immigrants and their children, which is, I love Mexico. Like, I go all the time. I love to visit my family, because to me, my association with Mexico is like, that's where, you know, my tias are, and I get loved on, and I like museums and coffee shops and the food and all this stuff. My parents' association is, they grew up in dire poverty, and it was really hard. And it's very difficult to live under a government where the goalposts change all the time. You know, so they like, their feeling is very much like they're strongly connected to their family and like the culture, but they don't feel any kind of nostalgia for, like, you know, Mexico as a country. Whereas I have, like, multiple times in my adult life toyed with the idea of, like, oh, you know, maybe I would, like, live there for a year or two. You know, I really love Mexico City. So but that dynamic, I think, is actually, like, pretty common. I didn't immigrate from there, so I don't have that in my psyche as, like, oh, this is a place that I left because I wanted my kids to have something different. You know, to me, this is like, oh, this is a place I, you know, go when I'm, like, having happy, relaxed times, you know, in the summer. So, you know, there's that.
What kind of work was your dad doing that brought him to New York in the first place?
Yeah. So both my parents grew up on the border, but at different parts of the border. So my mom is from Coahuila, which is right south of us. And my dad is from Reynosa, which is right across from McAllen. And my dad's, like, work stuff is interesting to me in an adult in a way it was not when I was a kid. So my dad actually started the 9th grade when he was 21, but finished with his master's degree. So he has a degree in business. And they sent him to New York City. It was a mineral company. So Mexico is the largest exporter of silver in the world. It has, like, a ton of natural resources. So it was some kind of, like, commodities trading. And this is where I'm, like, hesitating, because it's not really my story. But the upshot is that my dad kind of saw, like, oh, you know, there was stuff going on in Wall Street in the 80s in New York that made my dad feel like maybe this was not, like, a life path that fit with his personal ethics, you know? And so when we moved to Texas, it was a totally different, you know, professional path. So, like, for most of my childhood growing up, my dad did human resources. But I didn't, like, I didn't grasp until I was an adult that, like, oh, my dad could have had this, like, very different professional path, but, you know, didn't. I mean, like, just as an illustrating point of, like, how my parents are, when we would go visit my mom's family, when I say that my mom's family lives on the border, I mean, it's walking distance. Like, the bridge is walking distance from my abuelita's house. But at Christmas, to go back to the US right after Christmas, sometimes it can be like an all-day wait in the car, because everybody's doing what we're doing, right? You go see family, and then Christmas is over, whatever. And I remember one Christmas when I was probably in, like, junior high school, we were in the car something like 4 hours at an intersection, because every other car was bribing the cop, right? He's letting this car go, that car go, this car go, this car go. Not our lane. Not our lane. Because my dad will just have us sitting there for hours rather than participate in what he is like corruption. So I just can't even imagine like that man being in like Wall Street in the 80s.
Silver trading. Yeah.
Yes. You know, so, but you know, these are the things that like, you don't think about or question growing up. And that as an adult, I appreciate the like, yeah, my dad is somebody that I really look up to and admire, is somebody with a lot of integrity, you know.
You said you did K through 12 school in Arlington. I assume that was in public schools the whole way?
Whole way through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you were able to take advantage of some pretty cool educational opportunities beyond that. Tell me about those.
Yeah. So my mom's side of the family are all teachers. Like my abuelita was a teacher for like 60 years in Mexico. And like the specific reasons my parents came here was for their education. So my parents had a very, very like school oriented focus for my sister and for me. And kind of deal was that my parents were like, you girls should go wherever you can get in, you should go. And my sister took that at face value, and she applied to all kinds of Ivy League schools and ended up going to Dartmouth. And she didn't see the campus until her first day there.
Oh.
Yeah. And her high school counselors, some were very encouraging, but like one of them actively discouraged her as like, public school kids never get into these schools. Why are you wasting your parents' money on like application fees? You know, so she kind of ripped that Band-Aid for me, and honestly for like my little circle of friends, is that we figured out like, oh, actually like people do get in, and why shouldn't we apply? So I also went to Dartmouth, but I give my sister the credit of being like kind of the ballsy one, of just deciding whole cloth that, you know, why shouldn't she get in? So I went to Dartmouth for undergrad, and I had no idea, none, what I was getting myself into.
How much older is your sister?
She's 4 years older.
Okay. So were you ever able to visit her up there while she was in school, or?
I went to her graduation, and I saw her, I visited her once, which was my college visit, but I didn't do a college tour. I skipped my prom because there was a whole thing that was happening in Arlington around my high school prom that made the national news, which is a different story. But I was kind of I was mad at that point. And I was like, I am leaving football culture forever. And so I wanted to go to any place that was not Dartmouth, because that's what my sister had done. So I flew up to Boston by myself, and bless her heart, in the middle of, I think it was her finals week, she picked me up and she drove me to Cornell, where I was, like, I had registered and I was on the wait list at Dartmouth. And we had a big fight in the car coming back, and I was like, oh, I'll never go to your school. You can't tell me what to do. And when we got back to campus, she was so mad at me. She's like, I have tests, I have exams. And she took the class book and threw it at me and said, like, go entertain yourself, take some classes. So I sat in on 3 classes and had this like, oh shoot, I love it here, I gotta go. So I walked myself without telling her or anybody to the admissions office, wearing cutoff jean shorts and a Cornell t-shirt and flip-flops, and then just sat there in the admissions office for like 2 hours until somebody would talk to me, and kind of talked my way in. So that's where I ended up going. So that was my, like, I sat in on those 3 classes. I went, but I did not, like, I was just thinking in terms of like the classes, and not in terms of like, oh, this is like an entirely different planet, alternate universe. than public schools in Arlington,
Mm-hmm.
Texas, where I had grown up.
Let's see. Did you know at that point that you wanted to become a teacher? You mentioned that so many
Oh,
people in your family were teachers.
how would 18-year-old, 22-year-old, 25-year-old me would have punched somebody in the face if they had told me that I would like move back to Texas and then become a public school teacher like 15 minutes from where I had grown up. Like, absolutely not. I just, that's the last thing that I wanted to do, that I thought of doing. Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Mm-mm.
So how then did you become a public school teacher?
So, okay. This is very cliche. This is like an extreme cliche that is embarrassing to tell, but this is like true facts. This is how it happened. I was working as a hospital administrator, right? Which is in itself hilarious because my undergraduate major was French and Spanish literature. So I had done like a lot of like, 16th century Spanish plays and like 19th century French poetry. But I graduated into a recession, and I moved to Boston with the sum total plan that like my two best friends were moving there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ended up like temping at Massachusetts General Hospital in the transplant unit, and they hired me. They actually made up a job for me. So I worked there for years. I started out as like the temp, and I left as like the practice manager of the outpatient transplant clinic and the nephrology division, right? So it was like a fascinating life experience, but very foreign to, me. And I had this fantasy in my mind that I would go to Italy, right? All of my other friends were traveling, and I really wanted to go to Italy. And so I finally got to go, and I went. And when I was in Italy, it was the first time, like, since my college graduation that I'd had like geographic and mental space to really think about things. And I just had a life epiphany of like, I don't think I'm ever going to be anything more than like a middling hospital administrator. My boyfriend is not that nice to me. So I went to Italy, a hospital administrator, and I came back and I quit my job the next day and broke up with my boyfriend the next day that I got back. And then I had like a life crisis of like, whatever is the next thing that I want to do, I don't want to like stumble into it out of necessity. I really want to like choose something that has the potential for me to be satisfied by it, So I realized that if I stayed in Boston, I would just end up like through inertia doing similar kinds of work. So I moved back to Texas after like traveling and bumming around for a year. I moved back to Texas, and I have like the perfect plan, which is I'm going to be a book and paper conservator. And that was going to tie in like every single interest that I have, right? I'm just picturing myself with medieval manuscripts. I've got the languages, I've got the history. I have everything, really that you need to be a book and paper conservator. The only thing that I was missing was chemistry. So I thought like, I'm going to take some classes in chemistry, and then I'm going to apply to grad school for these things. And it's just going to be like the most perfect fit. But meantime, I'm broke, just broke. So I'm going to substitute teach as a stopgap. So the first day that I'm a substitute teacher, the assignment that they gave me was home ec, which I didn't know still existed. All right. And this is in the same school district that I grew up. This is like 15 minutes away easily from the elementary school or the junior high school that I had attended. If you had asked me that morning, I would have told you, I know everything about Texas schools and like Arlington schools because I'm a product and I grew up there, right? So the class that they give me is home ec. It's all brown and black kids all day long, like a smattering of white kids. The posters on the wall are, don't get pregnant, don't do drugs. The assignment that the teacher left was for me to read a chapter with the books and then give them like a homework sheet that was handmade. The chapter was on cleaning, and the homework assignment was on laundry, right? So I was just like, what? This is not what I remember school being like. Like, what is this? So I thought, like, well, at the very least, I guess like the way I can make this as educational as possible is I'm going to have kids read this chapter out loud, right? And after the first class, I realized, like, they don't know how to read. Like, there are kids in this class that don't know how to read. And there was one girl who refused to read. And I didn't know anything about kids. And so I forced her to. I humiliated her in front of all of her classmates because I didn't know, she didn't speak English. So in my total innocence, I went to the front office at lunch, just frantic. Did you know that there's these kids and they don't know how to read? And you know, they're laughing at me because, like, no, this is just the state of being, right? This is just like what schools are. And up until like that day, I thought that my sister and I had gone to Dartmouth because we were just so smart, right? Like I thought, like, if you had asked me, I would have told you, like, oh, you know, we studied so hard and we're just, you know, very hard workers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just realized, like, holy wow, if I had gone to this school, there's no way, you know, there's just absolutely no way. And what upset me then and upsets me now is I'm seeing myself as like a, you know, bilingual 12-year-old. And at the time when I would try and say that, people want to exceptionalize me, right? Of like, oh, no, these kids aren't like you. Like, no, these kids are actually exactly like me. Like, these kids are very easily me, or these kids are very easily like my parents as 12-year-olds, right? And so I, like, that day, like, that was it. That was it. I was just totally both hooked by the experience of hanging out with kids all day, and hooked and disturbed by the question of, how did this class come to be? The whole school isn't learning about cleaning.
Mm-hmm.
How did this class come to be? How did this group of kids reach this point without having what I consider to be like basic skills? Why are they in a room that is like, don't get pregnant, don't have drugs? Why aren't they in a room that is like history, literature, you know, stuff? It just, everything about it, I didn't understand how, I didn't understand why. I just didn't understand, like, how that came to pass. And that question, or that series of questions, has driven my entire career since then, you know. And when I say that, like, I was hooked on like hanging out all day with the kids, I thought that like all of my interest led very directly into like book and paper conservation, because I was picturing that my life path was going to end in me working in a really beautiful place with really brilliant people, you know. Like, this is what I thought that, like, oh, I'm having like my 20s adventures, but like the inevitable path here is I'm going to be like in a museum or an academic library, and I'm just going to be talking to, you know, brilliant people, and you know, handling these wonderful materials that fascinate me so much. And it since is now like, the 2020 is very clear to me that, like, if you ever talk to archivists or like actual conservators, I'm still fascinated by them. I'm exactly the opposite personality type, right? which is like one thing that like when you're a young person, you don't think about that when you're thinking about jobs, right? But as an adult, I realize like, oh no, it's kind of a thing if everybody around you is like exactly the opposite personality type. But my like epiphany and self-knowledge now as a person in the workplace is that I thought that my joy was like knowing and learning all of these things, and it's not. My joy is sharing that. My joy is like, I just learned this interesting thing, and now I'm gonna force you to hear it, and now we know this interesting thing. You know, that's what is fun to me. It like many years later in graduate school, I think like my last gasp of, well, you know, maybe I'll like leave teaching and work in a museum, is that in graduate school, I was a graduate student teaching fellow at like the university museum. And that was exactly like exactly how I pictured it. This is a really beautiful place. There's a really brilliant people. And I realized like, oh yeah, no, I'm totally bored. Because the fun here is I just want to like grab people and, you know, did you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's also like, in retrospect, hilarious hints that like when I lived in Boston, not once, but like multiple times, I would give total strangers that I met on the full Freedom Trail tours, right?
From memory?
Oh yeah, no, I love that. Like I would do the Freedom Trail.
Oh wait, you actually took them on the Freedom Trail, or you did this
like,
on the train?
Physically put them on the whole trail. People that I would just see like looking at maps on the subway, like whole thing, you know. So like, I said that like if you had told me, I would have punched you in the face, and like it was when I finally arrived myself, like, hey guys, like I think I'm gonna be a teacher. Everybody else around me was like, duh. You know, including my abuelita and all of my Boston roommates who had to live with me, like, did you take total strangers on a Freedom Trail tour again? Because you're home very late. Oh no, just like the site of the Boston Massacre, you know, because they wouldn't have known things. So I just wanted to share those things. Yeah. So I am not one of those people who like grew up knowing, you know, this was the career path that I would take. It kind of landed on me. But yeah, it was one day of substitute teaching, and it just clicked of like, oh no, this is it. This is the problem I want to be working on.
That's great. I'm trying to remember if I've ever heard anyone say that they got into it for the equity and justice issues.
I
mean, everyone has to deal with those issues once they get in, but I can't remember anyone else telling me that that's why they got in.
I never, like, if you had asked me at the time, I wouldn't have said it that way.
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't have said it that way. I wouldn't have understood it that way. That's not the language I use. And I know people who, like, if you ask them, they'll say, like, they went into education for social justice or whatever. I'm like, I didn't, and yet I did, you know. But I definitely, like, I just love literature so much, and I love history so much, and it just, to the core of my being, I cannot handle that there's like kids going through school and that is inaccessible to them, and they're spending their time being shunted off in these other ways. And like, you know, I now see that, like, there are many well done vocational programs. I don't want this to be, you know, against, you know, home ec, but I would have said that, like, I love literature so much that I think that everybody should have access to it. Whereas now I would say, like, yeah, no, that's equity. Like, it's equity. It's morally wrong for kids in a community to not be getting equal access. And it's unconscionable that, like, you know, my sister and I going to Dartmouth is partially just like luck of a zip code, and my parents being savvy enough to pick a good elementary school, you know, where there I have met and taught so many kids that were, you know, remind me of like kid me.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, it's just not right, I guess. So there you have it.
How did you choose middle school?
So I spent about a year substitute teaching, and um, I thought that I would do high school. I thought that I would do like high school AP, and I substitute taught a lot in elementary schools and realized immediately, like, I cannot handle elementary school. It's not my ministry. I spent a lot of time in high schools, and one of my assignments was at the high school that I attended. So my high school principal was married to my 6th grade reading teacher. So I had known this man since I was 12. And he sees me there in the front office, and he I mean, bless him, because this is an enormous high school, and he was a really busy man. But he asked me to come back to have like a sit down, you know, of like, what are you doing back in Texas, and like, what are your plans and whatever. And he offered me a job teaching AP Spanish, which is the kind of job offer that you get when somebody has known you since you were 12. You know, that's not like a typical, you know, in off the street teacher job. But he asked me a lot of questions about the substitute teaching, you know, things I had seen, things I thought. I told him about the home ec class, and he told me that if I wanted to do something that was going to be more satisfying to me intellectually, that I would teach high school. I would teach like advanced high school classes. And if I wanted to do something that had a lasting impact, I would do elementary school, right? And he said it straight out. He's like, this is why you remember everything about my wife's class, right? And I do. I remember everything from Mrs. Adams' class. I teach books that Mrs. Adams taught me, you know. And he laid it out in that way, and I realized, those are two different things, right? Those are two different things. And I decided to split the difference and go with middle school. So middle school is the last kind of 5 minutes in a kid's life where the adults around them have like just a smidge more influence than their peers, you know? So I can, even if you are very behind, I can like almost just by force of personality wrangle you in and catch you up a significant amount, you know, before you go on to high school. And in the public imagination, when we talk about, you know, kids dropping out, a lot of people, what they're picturing is like a high school senior that doesn't quite make it, but statistically it's 9th graders. So we either have you or we do not have you in the 9th grade. So they are young enough that you can catch them up, not entirely, but you can catch them up significantly. You can pull them in. You can make them think about their academic selves, even if they haven't considered themselves to be academic people, but they are still young enough that they're like silly and fun and like entertaining. And once you're in it, you realize that it's so hard to hire for middle school because nobody wants to do it, right? And so one of the reasons I've stayed in it is just because like middle school teachers we're few and far between. We don't last super long, and it's just a crucial part of, you know, those are hard years on kids. Those are really hard years on kids. So that's why I started it, and then that's why I stayed.
That's why you stay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall when you first heard about the coronavirus?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
What were the
Um,
circumstances?
so um, I have a kind of a group chat going with a whole bunch of friends, and they have many different careers, professions, so on and so forth. They're mostly tech people, like people who work for biotech places in Boston. There's some journalists in there. Um, I think I'm the lone teacher. And it's a fun group because my like in-person day-to-day life is a lot of teachers and schools and so on and so forth. So it's fun to have a social circle that is,
Mhm.
involved in other stuff. And one of my best friends from college is in this group, and he works for a tech company, and it's just a very mathy crowd, right? And so about February, January, people start posting about this virus that's happening in China, and then using math of like, oh, this has the potential to be something very, very, very bad. And I thought that they were being paranoid. I thought that they were being overblown, but they're also a crowd that has been right on a lot of things. And then late February comes around, and the same friend is like, we're thinking of pulling our daughter out of school. I was like, do you really think that it's going to reach that level of seriousness? And they start posting a lot of epidemiologists and scientists saying like, yes, everywhere else is starting to worry about this. I think that we're at a point where we should all be like stocking up groceries. So I told everybody at school, so I stocked up. I looked up on the CDC. CDC said to like stock up for 2 weeks. And so I went, and I went with the intention of like buying supplies for 2 weeks. And I ended up buying like a lot of marshmallows because I got distracted. And then I told everybody at work, and we all laughed about it. And then I made a second run, but I just felt so silly because it's like a normal Target. It's just like a normal Target day. And I felt like a TV prepper, like a doomsday prepper. Like, all right, okay, like pasta, whatever, I don't know. And I told my colleagues at work, I think that this has the potential to be like pretty bad. And I had been myself pretty sick in February. And my best friend is a nurse, and she lives around the corner. And it was like top of mind to me that when I had gotten sick, she had left me stuff on the porch, And so I thought like, well, that's how I took the CDC thing of like, even just for like a regular flu, it's nice to have like your crackers, your soup, your whatever, because, I remember that I didn't want to get in my car and go. And so I said this, and then because they were posting about it, I started like reading about it and realizing like, oh shoot, no, this is a thing. And do you know that I honestly, like really truly with no sarcasm, I think that part of the problem with all of us is that in the US, our numeracy skills are so low that people don't understand how exponents work, right? Like literally people in the US, myself included, don't have good math skills and don't understand exponents. Mm-hmm. So that a graph that goes like this seems like not scary, but like if you've ever run a compound interest graph, it goes like this real fast. So it ended up hitting Boston a lot sooner than other places, partially because there was one company that had a conference that invited a whole bunch of people, Biogen, and Biogen became a hotspot. Like a lot of my people in this friend group were like 1 or 2 degrees of separation.
Interesting.
From this company. So that was like, that was that. So like Twitter and like, my personal brain trust there was telling me something different than like the local news.
Mm-hmm.
And I went with like, these are like a bunch of like scientists and mathematicians. So there's that. So I feel like I was not caught off guard, and I was very thankful that I felt like I had gotten like a heads up with enough time that like I didn't experience the like crazy, rush on the grocery store and everything. Right. But it's also just like a super strange feeling of like, oh, I didn't think that you were going to end up being right to that extent.
Yeah, that's something you want to be wrong about.
Yeah.
You want to overreact.
Yeah. So I was listening to the extent of like, okay, whatever, I'll make like a grocery run. But I was, like everybody else, like even if you're a person who like reads a lot of news, it's still, these are things that are like unprecedented in my lifetime.
Yeah.
Nobody gets a Spanish Inquisition. So
our experience here in Fort Worth was that the school district announced at nearly the end of spring break that, my recollection is this was on Thursday of spring break. It may have been Friday, but that there's going to be an extra week of spring break. And instead of coming back to schools, we're going to have online instruction. How did that affect you personally? I thought that they were going to make the announcement immediately at the beginning of spring break. So I spent all of spring break pretty freaked out and stressed out at the thought of going back, because I thought that they should have declared it like a week before. Part of that is that, so I went to grad school twice, right? Like I live and work in Texas, but I went to one grad school for a literature degree. I went to another grad school for ed school. So because of that, I have a very extensive social media circle of teachers that teach across the country and in other countries. And the New York teachers, by the time we were on spring break, the New York teachers, it was post after post after post after post begging to close the schools, close the schools, close the schools, close the schools. So I'm watching what they're going through, and then our spring break comes around, and at that point, I was really freaked out. I didn't know, like on the Friday that we left out, that was it. There's so much stuff I would have pulled from my classroom. I would have sent home with the kids and stuff. So I thought that the writing was on the wall. I didn't realize that it was going to be in that way. I remember texting I travel a huge amount. So already it was strange for me I felt like I was being unnecessarily paranoid by not traveling on spring break, but again, looking at my New York friends, I remember talking to a friend of mine in Seattle, because if you remember, like Seattle was one of the early hotspots. So I was just checking in, like, how's he doing? How's his family doing? And he was like, oh, it's very, very contained in like this nursing home. Checka, what do you do? Why don't you come up and visit? And I toyed with the idea. Like, he's in a hotspot and he keeps inviting, and like that family is so cute. I should just go. And I didn't go. So when the announcement came on that Thursday, I was very relieved. And I immediately started pestering our superintendent and my principal and my assistant principal on what I thought that we should be doing. So I was not surprised that we closed down. The lead time for us reacting to it in as a school district was frustrating to me at that point. And then had you had any training at all in online teaching? No, and I hate it. Like I actively hated it, hated the trend, wrote about it, talked about it. Because putting aside the pandemic, there is a strain of education reform that I am very much,
I mean no disrespect to Teach for America, and I have many people that I know and like that have worked for Teach for America, that are in Teach for America. This is not like a personal knock, but there is a certain life path of like Teach for America, fancy grad school, ed reform. That's not me, right? I am not a charter school person. I am not an ed reform person. I am emphatically none of those things. And a lot of people who kind of subscribe to this movement are very much in favor of stupid proofing curriculum against teachers. But like teachers are the weak link, right? So the way that you fix inequities is that you stupid proof so that the teacher is just a mouthpiece. And the ways that they do this is by like hyper scripted curriculums with very little teacher autonomy. Even in some cases, even in the state of Texas, they'll hire consulting companies where somebody is like in an earpiece saying, you know, now say this, now do that.
Oh my God.
Yeah, imagine you trying to teach your UNT class like this,
Oh.
right? And then really standardizing curriculum so that even an idiot can teach it. So this is a cheap way of ed reform, because spending money on a product that comes off the shelf, whether it's a packaged curriculum, whether it's, a coaching system, but especially, the cheapest way to do this is through technology, right? Is that you replace the instruction of a human with technology. And like our school district had already had an incursion of this, which I was horrified by, and I could do easily like a 2-hour thing on why that's so bad, right? So if that's one model of how to do ed reform, is to stupid proof the curriculum by sapping the teachers of all their professionalism, their autonomy, whatever. So with the intention of limiting the damage that an incompetent teacher can do, right? The flip side of that is what I support, which is very expensive, which is trained teachers. It's very expensive to train teachers. But if you give me whatever class, whatever supplies, whatever, I can teach it. You give me a tree and a whole bunch of kids and some chalkboard, I can teach it, right? Because I have a lot of experience, because I have a lot of training, because I have a lot of knowledge, and it makes me nimble and adaptable to what the needs of my students are, right? So if you train expensively teachers with a huge amount of content knowledge and a huge amount of pedagogy, then that even though it's a higher upfront cost, it's a better investment in the long term, right? Because you put me against a computer program and I'm gonna have better results every time because I'm a human, right? So I can engage with a 13-year-old on the level of, oh, okay, I see that you're getting this numeric score, but I also have all of this context that I'm getting as to like why that is. Todd, maybe your guinea pig died this morning, right? Maybe your best friend didn't sit next to you in the cafeteria. Maybe you're just like shy about saying stuff in front of your classmates. Maybe you just don't like soccer books, right? Maybe this is not your first language. There are like infinity number of things that to me as like a human person, I can see and respond and adapt to. Mm-hmm. That I think that every parent across America has now seen the limitations of, why that is. And the thing that was frustrating to me in the before pandemic times, right, is that I have a degree in education from Harvard. I don't need the education degree from Harvard in literacy to tell you this, because your eyes can tell you this. Do you know any educated person in your circle of friendships, like you personally, who taught their kids to read by
No.
sticking in front of a computer?
No.
No, you don't, right? No, you don't. Everybody that you know and that I know uh, has spent a lot of time thinking about how to like limit screen time, reads to their kids and stuff. Like, if that was how kids learned how to read, then every school district would just do that.
Mm-hmm.
You would buy that program and you would hand it to the child, like, problem solved, right? So I can explain extensively why that is, but honestly, like, you didn't do it, I wouldn't do it. Nobody learns how to read that way. So that was my feeling about online education beforehand, is that I was somebody who was resistant to the encroachment of something that could eventually replace me in a way that I perceived to be like not terribly effective. Because if you turn the teacher into just the proctor, what a waste, first of all. And if the problem is that the teacher is incompetent, the solution cannot be the curriculum, because you still have the incompetent person, right? So that was my feeling of online learning beforehand, is that I had a very, very negative attitude. And then boom, all right, now, this is what we're all going to do. And it was a steep learning curve. I don't think that I did a good job. Nobody that I know feels satisfied with, the level of instruction. And it's just deeply painful. It's like deeply painful if you are somebody who truly, truly, truly loves their job and loves the students and is invested in them learning, in feeling inadequate, like you're doing an inadequate job, So the short answer is like, no, I didn't have any training going into it. I tried to learn as fast as I could. And then I spent the rest of the spring feeling like I had gone from English teacher to tech support. The bulk of my time was not on instruction. The bulk of my time and the bulk of every teacher's time was trying to find all of our students, like trying to locate all of our students.
And find out who had Wi-Fi access and who didn't, and who couldn't.
We would literally, it took us 2 weeks to call every kid in the school. And it was awful. It was truly, truly awful. Parents would cry on the phone because they didn't know how they were going to pay rent. They didn't know how they were going to pay bills. They just lost their jobs. It was I think every teacher in America, easily 2 months before it started being on the news, could have told you that like this was impacting people in a very unequal way, right? Because you would have some parents that their biggest problem was boredom, that they're still getting income, they're at home, the biggest problem is boredom, right? And those were the parents who tended more to wonder, like, why isn't there more instruction? Why isn't there more school, right? And those parents tended to be more white and middle class. So they're high maintenance in a way that is totally understandable, right? And I don't mean high maintenance in a pejorative sense, right? But they're wanting like instruction, projects, give my kid more to do, right? My kid is so bored. And then you have parents who are just teetering on a financial ledge, right? Parents who are sick. So we had like one family where both the parents are sick on one side of the house, and the kids are taking care of themselves on the other side of the house. So you're calling to ask things like, have you seen the district webpage? Have you, done this, that, whatever? But really the phone call is about like, if all of your adults are sick, honey, do you guys have groceries? Who's bringing groceries to you? Do you know how to order? Like, you know, like these are wellness calls as much as anything else. These are like single parents that are essential workers, and the kid is just totally by themselves all day. We had one kid get assaulted at gunpoint, right? If you were a kid in a high crime apartment building, you were trapped inside for months, and you in July continued to be trapped in that way, and you can't live like that, right? So kids go outside to walk around just for months and weeks of being cooped up in themselves, and the kid gets mugged, and then needs the rest of the semester. He needs counseling. He needs to talk about it. He knows stuff. The birth order tended to be much more important than I ever anticipated. I thought that the deal, so, well, let me finish the thought. So like on the one hand, you have some parents who are like, they're high maintenance because they're wanting more academic stuff for their kids. On the other hand, you have parents, they are so overwhelmed. They are so overwhelmed. And the last thing that I want to do, or that the school wants to do, is to inject stress into that household. Like the last thing is like, and on top of everything else, can you please do like X, Y, Z, whatever. So in that dynamic, we're trying to take something off their plate, reassure them, not overwhelm them, make it clear that like, you know, do as much as you can, you know, so on and so forth. And parents would call crying that it was just too much. It was too much. And so, but it's the same assignment, right? So like the same assignment or the same dynamic for one family is inadequate, and for another family is too much. And what I mean when I say like birth order is, and this goes across like racial, ethnic, everything lines. If you are the youngest kid in your family, so you're seventh grade, which is what I teach, and your siblings are like high school, college, whatever, you have tutors, right? You like your older teenage siblings are like sitting at the kitchen table and like, okay, you come and sit at the kitchen table too, and we're gonna like do the thing, right? If you are the oldest sibling, you are the child care. And parents do this at all economic levels in a way that I perceive to be unfair, but you're the child care. So we would have class meetings, or we would have ARDs, or we would have whatever, and the poor kid is sitting there trying to pay attention with like little siblings crawling all over them, right? Wanting snacks, wanting this, wanting that, wanting the whatever. For reasons that are totally understandable. The parents are working from home themselves. The parents are essential workers and are outside the home, whatever. But basically, oldest kids in middle school were screwed by this situation. So there was that. And then there's like the logistical thing of, if you are not doing your homework and you are not checking in, is it because you're just not doing homework, right? Is it because you don't have access to it because you're having like internet hotspot? Or is something happening to you? Are you okay? Are you sick? Is your family sick? Is somebody taking care of you? And we just felt frantic about it. You know, we just felt frantic about it. So we were coming up with all of these systems to make sure that nobody's falling through the cracks, so that we know either like, okay, you're not doing your homework, but it's because like there's illness in your family, and that's what's happening. I'm like, okay, you know, okay. Or are you not because something is really wrong, right? And we, who usually would like see you every day and know to ask or be concerned or whatever, are not seeing you every day. Nobody is seeing you every day. So that sort of thing. So systems to make sure, and I'm talking here like a Slack group, Excel sheets on, have you talked to this kid? Have you talked to this kid? A constant conversation on like, they haven't done math, they haven't done math. They did science, okay, they're alive, right? They're alive. They may not be doing math, but like they're doing science, they're doing the stuff. And then, and all of this was prefaced by the perfect technological storm, which is that the FBI had been helping our school district the week before spring break because of a hacking thing. So the very first round, even before we get into all of the stuff that I'm describing, was simply individually for 86,000 students resetting passwords.
You know, I had totally forgotten about that.
Yeah, so that took, by the time that got done, every person on my street could give you the instructions for resetting passwords, because I would just pace in my front yard over and over and over and over again. I made hundreds of phone calls, literally hundreds of phone calls. Click here, do this, do that. And then, you know, for my street, I'm a bilingual teacher. And so I helped at least one of my neighbors get internet, you know? So I'm trying to like logistically help my own students. I'm trying to like, you know, be a good neighbor. I spend a lot of time on the phone, but it basically like this much percentage of my time was spent talking to other teachers, doing what I've described, right? Like comparing notes, did you do this, you do this, you do this, trying to learn and share with each other, you know, and this much time was spent on kids, right? And in a normal working environment, that's the opposite. And you know, at one point my assistant principal was asking me, you know, how to do something or other. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna invite you to our fake Google Classroom. And she's like, what do you mean the fake Google Classroom? Like, oh yeah, we've got a fake class, right? So we made a fake class where some of us were teachers and some of us were students. And that's how we would like test stuff out, right? So if I'm going to like give this assignment in this way, I'm gonna put it in the fake class, and then other adults who are students can see how it works and what it looks like for them. And then we like practice it. So we did like, you know, fake class Zoom, fake class Google Classroom, fake classes, that and the other. So we're like learning and learning and learning and learning and learning and learning. And she thought that was hilarious. And I was like, yeah, how do you think we've been doing this, right? Is that we have the fake class. And there was a tremendous like nationwide and international crowd sharing among teachers and parents on resources, you know, lots of Google Docs, you know, here's this, here's that, here's whatever. So I'm deeply grateful that I think my administrators were kind of the best case scenario of expectations of what we were able to do, expectations of what students were able to do, and realistic in terms of like the role that we were playing with families, which is very much, I mean, we were explicitly with the understanding that like, we're not learning new things right now. We are maintaining what they have learned the rest of the school year. And we're trying to like inject comfort and normalcy, you know, for kids.
So you got that support, that level of understanding and support from both your school administrators and the district administrators, you would say, or I heard you say it about school.
I didn't have any interaction with the district administrators, which is not unusual. Our school like rarely does. So my universe is like pretty cut off to like my campus, you know. The district went with a canned online learning thing, which embodies the problems that I was talking about, right? It feels good because it's a product and it's self-contained and there it is, right? It's one of those instances in which I would love to not be right. I would love to not be right, but like well, how'd that go? How'd that go? Yeah, it turns out that like, that's not how kids learn. That's not how kids work, right? So to the extent that we had that program, there was very low engagement with students. To the extent that we were doing things ourselves, there was more engagement with students. But it was a very, very, very difficult balance and no right answers on, you know, you're hearing from some places, like I was hearing from a lot of university professors that like asynchronous is the way to go, right? And then I'm hearing from others that like, nope, they want synchronous, you know, like what is the correct thing to do in these instances? And we're just guessing, you know, we're just like guessing and trying out and guessing and trying out. And the kids were just so sad. I mean, they were just so sad. There's a handful that like happy as clams, you know, middle school is miserable, totally happy to like goodbye with all of this drama. You know, typically those are kids who have like a lot of siblings or cousins at home, you know, and then there are other kids who were just, I mean, just totally devastated. We found out very, very, very rapidly that parent phone numbers are not totally useless, but they're kind of useless. You need the kid phone number, right? You need the kid phone number. And this is like a total pet peeve on my part, but one thing that was a difficulty was the one difference between like parent expectation and teacher expectation, right? Is that my expectation is that if you're in the 7th grade, you know how to call me, right? I don't need to be getting, you know, emails from your mom that you didn't understand, like number 5, blah, blah, blah. So I would kind of do this passive aggressive thing of like email the kid back and then CC the parent, right? Which like, I am very happy to like communicate with parents, right? But kids do this thing where they will just like ask the nearest adult. Mm-hmm. But you don't need to be interrupting your mom in the middle of her working or doing whatever. You can actually just ask in the same way that you do at school. Like you're you know, 12, 13, you're old enough for that. So that's like I had an avalanche of parent phone calls from not my students' parents, from friends that have kids. And that's something that I told them over and over and over again. I actually did a Facebook Live about it on like, it's fine for your kid to not know things. That's fine, right?
They just have to try to figure it out.
They have to figure it out, and sometimes they're not going to. But if you're like totally stressed out as the parent of like my kid's turning in crappy assignments, or like I don't know the math to help them with this, like that's fine. Just send it, right? Like have the kid turn in their crappy assignment, and the worst that's going to happen is that it'll alert me, their teacher, to like, oh, well, Todd doesn't understand fractions. You know, I guess
I need to work with Todd on fractions.
And you need to work on Todd on fractions. And like kids turn in crappy work all the time. You just weren't aware as a parent, right? Like it's, your kid turns in crappy work all the time because they're in middle. Like that's an okay and normal thing. And send it to me. And like, I'm very well equipped to like, okay, I see that you are having trouble here. Let me walk you through, you know, this and this and this and this and this, right? But parents and teachers too, when we get outside observation, you feel judged by your kids' work, right? You feel like, well, if the kid's turning it in, this is a reflection also on me. And like, that's just not how that's not how I as a teacher think, right? But I relate to it because when my principal comes and observes me, that's exactly how I feel, mm-hmm. right? Is that when kids say things, I'm just like, oh God, I swear I did teach them that. You know, so that was a thing. That was interesting.
Yeah. Something you said a minute ago raised a question. You teach at Applied Learning Academy mm-hmm. in West Fort Worth, which draws from all over the school district. It's not a neighborhood school.
Right.
And so I know as a parent of a former ALA kid that it's ethnically diverse, it's very economically diverse, it's very zip code diverse. I mean, did that pose special challenges when you were trying to reach all of these families?
I don't actually know where the kids live. I never have. Like I have no way. Like I can know to the extent that like I can individually look up a kid's address and then put it on a map. But like I have 130 students, so I'm never going to do that. So I know where the kids' neighborhoods are to the extent that they talk about their neighborhood, right? So I can tell you some of them, but most of my students, I wouldn't be able to tell you what neighborhood they live in. You actually get to know where the kids live in when you do bus duty, right? Like who's on which bus,
right?
I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say that was an issue because we were online. I would say that like it was very much not like I wouldn't have been able to map out for you this neighborhood, these kids here, these kids there, these kids, whatever, because like they could have been on Mars, right? They could have been on Mars, they could have been Massachusetts, they could have been whatever. But I can tell you like it was very, 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 very evident that like some of these families are being affected in very different ways. Some people never stop working. I have one student who was in my summer classes, right? And this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like I'm doing like my finger shake here. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Mom's at work, right? And kid has trouble logging into Zoom. And the way that he solves this problem is that he calls his mom at work, right? And so mom is calling me and relaying this and is like super, super, super stressed out, right? So like after all of this is over, I call and I'm like, put me on speakerphone. And then I give the kid the business a little bit of like, you need to call me, right? What's your mom gonna do from work to help you get on Zoom?
She's got her own problems.
She's got her own thing, right? This is like the sort of thing that I'm talking about. But after I give the kid the business, I talked to the mom because and she was just so stressed out, right? Because she feels very like, oh no, is this teacher thinking that I'm, and I was like, no. That's actually why I wanted to talk to you both at the same time of like, you can call me. You don't need to call you at work, and I knew that she worked in the cafeteria, right? And so I was asking her about it. She told me, this is in June, she had 3 days off since the last day of spring break. 3 days off since the last day of spring break. Because one of the things that happened is that all of these kids that rely on the schools for free and reduced lunch needed meals during the shutdown, still need meals. This is still going on. So she wasn't even on her own campus. She told me she puts out 400 meals a day. As a cafeteria manager, 400 meals a day, has had 3 days off. And I'm talking to that lady and it just fills you with such a feeling of humility and such a feeling of like, ma'am, to the extent that it's possible, please let me take this off your plate. And please, in Spanish, you say, me lo encargas, like, I don't know how to translate it exactly, but it's basically like, si me lo encarga, it means I'm putting my trust in you for this thing, right? So it's that like just put your trust in me for the summer class thing, because my word, like as much as like I feel like I worked hard, but like it's humbling, it's very humbling.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I don't know how to ask it except to just say this is word association.
Yeah.
But this is related to that. Just word association, essential workers.
Worried. I just worry a lot about them. The essential workers are, my tío right now in Arlington has COVID, right? Essential worker. He lives with my cousin. How can you live in the same house and now worry that the other person is also going to get sick, right? Social media lets me know that the other people that I know who have gotten sick are old students, essential workers. The one time that I went in store to a box store, I went to Target, and I lasted about 5 minutes. I almost started crying and I walked out because one of the women working at Target at the checkout, you know, there's all these people going past, no mask, no mask, no mask, no mask. And this is one of my old students, and she's got a toddler. You know, I've been teaching a long time. I've been teaching long enough that my old kids have little kids of their own. You know, and they're at risk. You know, the essential workers have been at risk. They have been put in danger by the rest of us. Not all of those jobs were essential. And the jobs that were essential, that like literally, hey, we can eat because people have been at the grocery store, they've been spat on and coughed on, and people walking by with no masks. And it's not right. You know, it's not right. So when I think of essential workers that are not in healthcare, my word association is that I worry for them. And unfairness. I think that the position that they were put in is like unfair. You should not be putting like young moms in front of people to get coughed on and breathed on with no mask, and then pay them nothing, and then say, you know, that they're such heroes. Essential workers who are healthcare workers, I just have a deep sense of gratitude. Part of the reason I bought a house in this neighborhood is because my third grade best friend lives around the corner. But she's a nurse at Harris, and she's been on a COVID ward since all of this started. And it has affected her so deeply. You know, what nurses and clinicians have seen and experienced and gone through is awful. And I think that we owe them all a debt of gratitude. My sister is an oncologist in Houston at MD Anderson, you know, and I worry about her all the time. And she, in turn, you know, every single one of her patients is immunocompromised because she's an oncologist. So the essential workers that were truly essential, I think we have mistreated. The essential workers that not essential workers are people who like work in restaurants, and they shouldn't have been put at risk like that. And the essential workers who are in healthcare, I feel a deep sense of gratitude towards.
Do you identify yourself, your own profession with that term?
I would answer this today differently than I would have 2 months ago. America has a very dysfunctional attitude towards teachers. That did not start with the pandemic, right? We have an entire genre of movies that is inspirational teaching, right? And that attitude that we have as a society allows us to underpay teachers, to disrespect teachers, to think that teachers' skill is something that can be replaced with a computer program. It's mostly because we're women, you know, by and large. You can do all of these things if you simultaneously romanticize this as a heroic gesture rather than a profession, right? So I have always, since the beginning of, I mean, as a substitute teacher, completely rejected the notion of heroic teacher. I find it distasteful. And I find people who paint themselves that way distasteful. Because usually what it means is you work with brown and black children, right? If that is such a sacrifice to you, then like, pardon my French, but like screw you and go do something else, right? It is not a heroic thing of what I do for a job or how I do it. That is my profession, and it's an honor for me to do it, and it's a privilege for me to do it, and it's not the other way around, right? My gravestone will say, I taught, you know, Janet Diaz, I taught Myra Rivera, I taught Omar Marquez, not the other way around. What I do in my classroom is not saving anybody. It's what I am paid to do. I am not, you know, healing the blind and leading the sick and so on and so forth. I help middle schoolers become better readers. I am, in fact, paid to help middle schoolers become better readers, right? I take a lot of pride in it. I take it very seriously, but that is my profession. I'm not volunteering my time. I'm not Mother Teresa. That is my profession. When I hear that kind of language, I know that that person has contempt for what I do. Because this is the kind of language that makes it okay to underpay me. This is the kind of language that makes it okay for me to not be treated like a professional, for me to not have autonomy with my curriculum, for my knowledge and expertise on literacy to be like the last one consulted, right? That like every single, like The Economist, you know, all of these other people can have an opinion on what I do in my classroom, but I'm just like such a sweet person to do it, right? I am not a first responder, and I carry so much bitterness and so much anger and so much resentfulness on what has happened to us with school shooting that it's hard for me to talk about it without sputtering. But I have sat in our school library and had a trauma nurse answer the question posed by a teacher. Well, what do we do if it's our life or the kids? And heard the trauma nurse try and like say without saying, you know, basically we hope you choose the kid. That is such a monumentally unfair burden to put on your kid's PE teacher. It's disgusting. Because what it is that there are certain topics that society at large and our elected leaders feel uncomfortable talking about because it's unpopular and it's difficult to talk about. So they just don't. They don't. And so they put it on us. And I have been to that rodeo, and so has every other teacher in America. We have been to this rodeo. And so the instant that somebody said related to COVID, they won't put the kids in danger, immediately I know, and everybody who has been in a classroom knows, of course they will. Of course they will. They do it all the time. They do it all the time. And I'm speaking nationally, But in the state that we live in Texas, at our last two most recent school shootings, when the governor made a task force, that task force addressed everything but guns. And each time somebody was interviewed, they would say, well, you know, right now is not the time to talk about it. Right now is not the time to talk about it. Right now is not the time to talk about it. And so money was spent on safeguards within the school building. Safeguards like our school got a new gate all around it. We now have, instead of keys, we have badge entries. We have a button that's in, you know, in the intercom that lets you in. It's required for me and for all the kids to have a badge all the time to get in. Why? So that if we get shot, that's the identification. That's the explicitly explained reason on why we have that badge, right? Money was spent on safety measures within the school wall. Money was spent on training within the school wall. And that training has escalated and escalated and escalated to where now I have a 90-minute state-mandated training on trauma bleeding. I have a kit in my classroom that has tourniquets in it, and it has 2 tourniquets in it. And the reason it has 2, and they told us this, and we had to practice doing them, is that the most effective tourniquet is a combat tourniquet. Well, who uses combat tourniquets? Not children, so they're not child-sized. So that's why we have the other tourniquet, right? So when I hear coronavirus, PPE, money, budget money spent on this, that's what I'm hearing. You want to spend within the school wall. You want to train within the school wall, as though this is like a little island, right? But it's not. So the week before spring break, I ran the school vegetable garden, and we're supposed to put in our seeds before spring break. And I have it all planned out. I've picked the day, we've picked the weather, we've done all this stuff. We go out there to plant our seeds, and the campus police officer, because schools in the US have campus police officers, starts screaming at my kids from his police car with the lights blaring, "Go inside the school, there's a shooter, there's a shooter." And so I take the kids and I'm yelling at them, like, just drop it, run, 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 run. I'm physically hurting, running the kids inside the school building. And there's our school librarian with the door open. "Get in here now, get in here, get in here." We're running it. We go in, we lock the door, and they say, is this practice? I'm like, no, it's not. So we just sit there for like an hour wondering what happened. And it turns out that there had been a shooting down the street in a restaurant, right? That was the day before spring break. That was my last experience of how the state of Texas protects me and protects my students. That's what it's like to be a teacher in the US. I can't plant the goddamn vegetable garden because, you know, none of the people who put those policies in place have to interact with those kids or those parents. None of them. They don't have to like explain to kids or talk to kids. They don't have to be in the dark library with them, you know, trying to reassure them while simultaneously having no idea what's going on, right? Those are the people who are in charge of protecting us from a pandemic. Those are the people who have my students' best interests at heart, who have my physical interests in best heart. No, they don't, right? Like they abundantly don't. You know, I mentioned to you my New York teacher friends begging their mayor, close the schools, close the schools, close the schools. He closed the schools, but after teachers die. They're dead, they're gone, that's it. There is no theoretical about it. So this whole idea that like, we're gonna deal with a public health crisis by spending budget money, by putting more safety measures inside the school is something that is fresh on my mind And I think fresh on many teachers' minds of like, oh, we've seen that. That doesn't work. Because if you were to take a middle school in Korea and it has no gate and no badge entry and no policeman and no bleeding kit, you know what? Those kids are safer inside their schools and less likely to get shot in a school shooting. Because the thing that makes you safe or unsafe is not within the purview of the school. It's that is within the hands of lawmakers to have those conditions being met or not. So when you say essential worker, what I'm hearing is, oh, you want to do to me like you've already done. And then say that I'm so heroic. And I'm not having it. One. Two, I had never fully grasped how much contempt people have for what we do. And now I know. Like, you have this paranoid fear that, like, man, people just see us as glorified babysitters. But now I know for a certainty, like, oh, wow, y'all just see us as glorified babysitters. You know, it took me until June to understand that there were parallel conversations happening, because the conversations that I'm having with myself, with my colleagues, with other teachers, is we're concerned about the education of the students. How best can we educate our students? How best can we address the learning losses that happen in the spring? How best can we plan for the fall so that we're not trying to guess at things, so that we have a coherent curriculum, so that we, have learned, how to deliver instruction online, which we may not love, but we can do. Like, how best can we make sure that you are a stronger reader at the end of every week? How best can we ensure that you know your fractions, that you know your cell cycle, all of these things? That's where our mindset is. And everybody else's mindset was, how do we get the childcare started for the economic engine to go on? And no. Am I an essential worker in terms of education? Yes. I mean, I have put myself into student loan debt for the rest of my adult life because I take that very seriously. Am I an essential worker in terms of childcare? No, that is not my responsibility. That is a deep need. That is like a legitimate need and a legitimate problem, but one that I'm not willing to risk my life over, because that is not what my career is. And furthermore, like, look how we treat childcare workers. Look how we pay them. So like, they do a tremendously important job. They're vastly underpaid. They're totally disrespected. And like, no. So that's where I'm at. And it further has upset me so much that people who have never, ever concerned themselves with equity, ever, shown up at a school board meeting, asked, cared nothing about equity, are now trying to use equity as a bludgeon of guilt. That if I'm unwilling to, put my health and safety in the hands of people who have never shown concern about it before, that it's because I just don't care about my students and I don't care about equity. And I will take criticism about equity and meeting student needs from kids. I will take it from their parents, but I sure as hell am not taking it from somebody who like wouldn't know equity if it hit them over the head, so that has been another one of like a lot of the criticism, the tone and the rhetoric of criticism of teachers showing any kind of hesitation of going back to work in person has been framed that we are selfish, that we put ourselves above essential workers, that we don't care or don't recognize the great need for childcare. And it just, it just burns me up. I don't know if that's what you were asking, but that's what I got.
I was asking for your perspective on it, and that's what I got. I appreciate that. We have covered all the topics that I had planned on covering, and I've already taken up more time than I told you I was going to take. But is there anything else that I haven't thought to ask about that you think is important to add to this?
I would add one brief thing, because this project is specifically like Latinx people, right?
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I think is an added worry for me personally is that a lot of us have family in Mexico. So you worry about your family here and you worry how this government is responding to it. You also worry about your family who is not here and how that government is responding to it. That's one big thing. And then something that is not affecting me personally, but that is very much affecting the community, and certainly in the community that I teach. If you are undocumented, you're screwed now on so many levels. And a lot of the aid that comes from nonprofits or that comes from the stimulus bill is totally inaccessible to you. And that's a real problem and a real concern. So those two things.
I admit that I have not followed the Mexican government's response to this as closely as I have the American government's response to it. How does it compare?
It's bad.
Worse?
It's bad. Well, it's not higher Bolsonaro bad, but it's not good. The president is a leftist, but he won't wear a mask. He keeps hugging people. He doesn't want to do like economic stimulus. So it's not great. And whenever I bring up Mexico and like problems that I have with the government, I always want to be super clear, like, yeah, our government right now is not a model of like anti-corruption, right? We don't have a leg to stand on, but all things being equal, they haven't been handling it well, in terms of other Latin American countries. One thing that I heard that just really dropped my jaw is one of my cousins who lives at the border. She works at a private school, and they're getting kids from the American side because the American side is a hot spot and the public schools were opening in person. So the kids are going to the Mexican side, to the private school. And I thought, like, that is where we're at. Like, that is where we're at, is that like Mexican schools are taking in American kids because of safety. So that really was like, whew. But yeah, it's not good. One of the funnier stories that I heard from students is there's this one family that went to Mexico during spring break, and the mom was telling me that they were like way out in the country, so they were like kind of away from social media and away from the news and whatever. And they drive back home to Texas after spring break. And as they're crossing the border and get internet access, their phones all blow up that like all of this stuff has happened. There's a pandemic, schools are shut down, everything is shut down. There's this whole thing, but they got it all in like one,
at the point where it was too late to turn around and
ignore
it. Yeah.
So anyway, that's the only addendum that I will put.
Well, I appreciate you sharing this with me.
Well, I talked your ear off, but it was fun.
I asked you to.
This is a lot of fun. I'm so sad I didn't get your kid in middle school.
I know, it was while you were in grad school, right? One of your MA programs.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking me to do this. This was a lot of fun.
I'm really glad you could do it. I learned a lot.
All right.
I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.
Mm-hmm.